the world has always been haunted by visions that lurk in the shadows of sacred texts, that whisper of inevitability, of judgment, and of the terrifying logic of destruction. We know them as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but the story we think we understand is incomplete. Most see only allegory, conquest, war, famine, and death, parading across the skies as ominous omens. Yet the deeper history, the human impulses that gave birth to these figures, the contradictions between prophecy and reality, and the motives behind their terrifying symbolism have been largely obscured. Who truly rides these horses, and why do they continue to haunt us centuries later? The earliest echoes of these riders come from the Book of Revelation, a text written in the waning days of the 1st century CE, a period of extraordinary instability. Rome teetered on collapse. Civil strife was rampant, and communities of early Christians faced persecution not only from emperors, but from neighbors, who often saw them as subversive. Revelation was not merely prophecy. It was a coded manual for survival, a lens to interpret suffering. The horsemen were not invented to frighten, they were invented to explain a world that was unraveling, a world where moral certainty had evaporated and the future was a territory of shadows. The first rider, often called Conquest, is usually depicted atop a white horse, a crown upon his head, bow in hand. Superficially, he embodies victory, the triumph of will over chaos. But if we peer closer, we see a figure of ambiguity. Conquest is not always righteous, and the crown he wears may not belong to him. Some scholars argue this rider represents imperial oppression, the relentless expansion of Rome, the annihilation of local cultures under the guise of order. To call him a symbol of good or justice is to misunderstand the terror he truly inspired. The fear that what seems inevitable might be morally corrupt, that power itself is a predator. The second rider, War, gallops on a red horse, brandishing a sword. Here, the symbolism tightens around bloodshed, yet history teases out contradictions. War is depicted as a force of divine judgment, yet human hands always guide him. In the 1st century Mediterranean, violent uprisings, slave revolts, and Roman reprisals blurred the line between punishment and opportunism. Who benefits when cities burn, when families are torn apart? Revelation implies the hand of God, but the record of history reminds us that human ambition, greed, and fear often dress themselves in the robes of inevitability. Every sword stroke carries a story of negotiation, betrayal, and calculated cruelty. Then comes the pale horse, ridden by death, accompanied by Hades. This is the most unsettling because it is not merely a rider, but an unstoppable principle. The historical context sharpens its edge. Plagues, famine, and war were daily companions to the early Christians. To Romans, to Jews, and to the multitude living on the margins, death was not an abstract idea, but a meticulously documented reality. Yet Revelation adds a layer of cosmic intentionality, as if mortality itself could be harnessed, summoned, and directed. It raises the question, was this imagery meant to console, to warn, or to frighten into submission? The same figure that terrifies also teaches about inevitability, about human vulnerability, and about the unsettling calculus of survival. The third rider, Famine, often overlooked, rides a black horse, clutching scales. The scales are not merely instruments of measurement. They are instruments of control. Famine in the 1st century was rarely natural. It was engineered through taxation, hoarding, and military strategy. To starve a city was to assert dominance without wielding a sword. Revelation's imagery conceals a political reality. Scarcity is always political, and the suffering of the masses is a ledger balanced for someone else's gain. The narrative suggests divine orchestration, but history whispers a more human, more chilling truth. Famine is a tool, wielded by those who understand fear, by those who know that hunger bends minds as effectively as chains. These riders, though separated in narrative, are intertwined in effect. They are a chain reaction. Conquest ignites war. War unleashes famine, and famine inevitably brings death. But consider the contradictions hidden in plain sight. Revelation presents this as divine inevitability. Yet every historian sees human causality. Every empire collapses not because of a moral scorecard, but because of mismanagement, ambition, and the fragile logic of power. The horsemen were not merely symbolic. They were allegories of real forces, distilled into myth, then amplified into moral terror. And what of their enduring power? Over centuries, the Four Horsemen have been summoned again and again, appropriated by preachers, writers and propagandists. The imagery was applied to medieval plagues, to European wars, to the nuclear anxieties of the 20th century. Each time the figure shifts, adapts, becomes more precise and yet more ambiguous. They are always a reflection, a mirror to the fears, contradictions, and blind spots of the society that invokes them. The horsemen are never static. They are a litmus test for our collective conscience, a reminder that catastrophe is both outside and within. Psychologically, the Four Horsemen tap into the most primal human fears. Conquest confronts our anxiety about power and subjugation, war our dread of violence and betrayal, famine our terror of deprivation and helplessness, and death our ultimate confrontation with the unknown. Yet these fears are layered with moral complexity. Is the horseman a messenger, or the messenger a mask for human cruelty? Was famine divine punishment or statecraft? Did war signify divine wrath or human ambition cloaked in a veneer of destiny? The ambiguity persists because Revelation deliberately blurs divine agency and human choice, forcing the reader to negotiate fear, ethics, and inevitability simultaneously. Even the imagery itself carries contradictions. White horses, red horses, black and pale, colors meant to signify clarity, yet instead they provoke unease. The crown of conquest may imply legitimacy, yet it is unattainable, fleeting, and perhaps illusory. The scales of famine promise fairness, yet they are instruments of inequity. Death and Hades ride together, companions who emphasize the inescapability of the final judgment. Yet their unity also conceals the human decisions that hasten demise. Revelation's poetry seduces, but it is not innocent. It is calculated, precise, and morally ambivalent, designed to unsettle as much as instruct. As we consider the Four Horsemen, we confront a mirror of ourselves. These writers are not only allegories of ancient terror, they are frameworks for interpreting power, violence, and scarcity. They remind us that apocalypse is not only a moment in the distant future or a literary conceit. It is embedded in the mechanics of human societies, in the choices made by rulers, generals, and ordinary people alike. Every conquest, every war, every famine, every death leaves a trace, a shadow, a moral residue that lingers long after the moment of action. The horsemen teach us that the line between divine inevitability and human responsibility is always blurred, and that terror is as much a tool as it is a warning. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this: they have never truly left. They ride still, not as spectral figures on parchment, but as forces in the human psyche and structures of civilization. Every war that erupts under the guise of righteousness, every famine that stalks the powerless, every epidemic that decimates communities, every conquest that disguises itself as progress, they are the horsemen. In flesh and policy, in law and in fear. To witness them is to recognize the complexity of moral and practical inevitability, and to ask ourselves which of their rides we are complicit in. History then does not comfort us. It unsettles. Revelation's riders are more than prophecy. They are a lens, sharpened by human cruelty, human fear, and the relentless logic of catastrophe. They ask us not simply to watch, but to reckon, to navigate the space between divine metaphor and human accountability. And in that reckoning lies the true horror, that the horsemen do not merely ride over time, they ride through it, echoing in every act of conquest, war, famine, and death, leaving us to ponder whether the apocalypse is a distant prophecy or an ever-present mirror, reflecting the choices we continue to